Hi, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Joshua Lamel. I am the Executive Director of ReCreate. We are a coalition that tries to represent the voices of those who are creating and sharing works online, as well as for consumers of online content. Today, we're here to talk about fair use. Fair use is one of those things that I like to say every American interacts with multiple times a day and does not realize it. And especially for Hill staff, whether you're in a public relations or digital shop where you're, pumping out all these communications all day and managing social media feeds and creating YouTube videos and everything else, to the policy people working on copyright policy and what fair use means for that. It's an important issue. Our goal today is to hopefully answer the question on my shirt. I wore this today because for those of you who don't know, these are the lyrics of a popular Talking Heads song. And I think they're open up the door is my shirt a fair use or not? And will you have an answer to that? And that is the purpose of today's session. With us is Betsy Rosenblatt. Betsy is an old friend and probably my favorite person on fair use out there. She is legal counsel to the Organization for Transformative Works with a ReCreate member, and she is also a professor of copyright law at the University of Tulsa. So with that, I'm going to give it over to Betsy, and she's going to go over kind of what we like to describe as the best 20-minute 101 on fair use.
Thank you. So we're going to be ripping through a lot of material today. For some of you, this may be extremely basic. For some of you, this may be entirely new. And I hope that I'm striking that balance. The code, section 107, is where we're going to go to. But we're going to start, as so many things do, with the Constitution. Because the Constitution gives us the basis for copyright law, which is to promote the progress of science and the useful arts. And that word progress is really crucial here because there's a fundamental tension in the very premise of copyright law. The idea is that by giving exclusive rights to authors, you allow them exclusive access to markets for their work. They can charge higher prices for their work, which allows them to recoup their costs and make a living. But at the same time, and by the way, it's not just artists, it's also publishers, etc. But there's an inherent tension in that, which is that what on earth makes anyone think that exclusivity would promote progress? Well, in a lot of ways, it doesn't. Right? Making the building blocks of expression and innovation more expensive or harder to use, how could that possibly advance progress? So that tension of, well, we want to give people exclusive access to markets, but we don't want to lock up the building blocks of creation is at the heart of the fair use doctrine. And so the fair use doctrine is a crucial part of copyright law that's aimed at uses of copyrighted works that promote progress more than exclusivity would promote progress, right? So there's this sort of comparison. Is exclusivity better, or is allowing someone to use this without permission better for progress? And that's the question we ask when we ask about fair use. So I tell you this, I go all the way back to the Constitution to point out that fair use is not, as it's often phrased, an exception or a defense or a loophole in the way that we think of those words many times, right? It's a fundamental copyright principle. Engaging in fair use of copyrighted material isn't infringement, but engaging in fair use of copyrighted material is something that the Copyright Act expressly authorizes as outside the scope of infringement. So, fair use is the principal safeguard of free expression when it comes to copyright law. Since the exclusivity and aspects of copyright are fundamentally limitations on expression, We need something that safeguards expression, and that's where fair use comes in. It does so based on a concept that a lot of scholars have termed market failure. The idea here is that it's essential that we allow some uses without permission because those uses are good. And we'll talk about what the definitions of good are here, right? Good for society, good for progress, good for advancing a variety of discourse, good for social justice, right? These are whatever they are, right? These sorts of expression are good. They promote progress, but needing permission for them would place too high a barrier on doing them. And this is what we call a market failure, right? If we had to ask for permission, they wouldn't happen. And here are a few examples, right? If we ask for permission to give a bad review to someone's art, they would say, no, I don't want you to do a bad review. You want to use my art? You can only say good things about me. If we wanted to ask permission to put a picture of a poster in a history book, along with lots of other posters and photographs and copyrighted material, right? Anyone who charged any appreciable amount of money would make it impossibly expensive to generate a history book. So, right, there's a market failure there. There are circumstances where you can't reasonably be expected to ask permission for something like recording Sesame Street when it's on so that you can watch it later when your kids are home from daycare. Right? You can't reasonably be expected to ask permission, and there isn't really a harm to the copyright holder of this. Another example is something like, say, mass digitization projects, where the whole point of the project is completeness, and any one holdout, the decision of anybody not to give permission, would make the whole project sort of useless. So these are 4 examples of situations where asking permission would just place too high a barrier on expression or technology or historical exposition or whatnot. Fair use is a very flexible system by design. It's designed for maximum flexibility to keep up with changing situations. We cannot predict every single instance, right? I've given you 4 examples, but there may be many, many more examples of things that we think are good for progress, but asking for permission would be too great a barrier to doing them. And so we have this very flexible system. When they wrote the statute, right, nobody knew that there were going to be viral GIFs, but viral GIFs are fair use because of this flexible system. And because copyright was designed for this different technological age, it could end up getting in the way of technological developments that we now take for granted, like viral GIFs, like printing out a web page, like forwarding an email, like watching TV on your DVR, or like sharing a video of your kid where there's music in the background. This video that I'm showing now is the subject of a very famous fair use case called the Lenz case, L-E-N-Z, where Stephanie Lenz shared this video of her kid. There's a song in the background, and the copyright holders of the song sent a takedown notice, and the court said, this is manifest fair use. Sharing videos of your kids dancing with your family is something you shouldn't have to ask permission for before doing. There's also technological progress at stake. The DVR that we come to rely on exists because of a well-known case called Sony versus Universal that held that time shifting for, recording TV so that you can watch it later is fair use. That case was about the Sony Betamax, but we can be sure that if time shifting were not fair use, nobody would have gone to the effort to develop the DVR. So we now have this very valuable technology because copyright allows it to exist. So that's some basic background, kind of what fair use does. What does fair use look like statutorily? I said we get here, and lo, here we are looking at the statute. Statutory structure begins by giving us a bunch of examples, things that Congress said were likely to be fair use. And you can see here that these are just examples, right? It says, purposes such as, right? So we know they're examples, but those examples include criticism, comment, news reporting, and teaching, scholarship, and research. Right? These are things that we think are likely to be fair use. Copying for purposes of those is likely to be the sorts of thing that promotes progress more than exclusive ownership would. But this is a non-exclusive list, hence the openness, the flexibility of the rule. And where we go from there is what we actually have to consider. The statute tells us that the fair use factors to be considered shall include, and then it gives us a list of 4. Now, if you've read the cases, you'll see that these 4 actually really break down to more like 7 or 8, depending on which court you ask. But I'm going to walk through what they mean and a little bit about how they get applied so that you can see how this flexible structure ends up working. So we begin with the purpose and character of the use. You can see already that this is going to have sub-questions. One of the questions is whether the use is commercial. Another one of the questions is whether it's for nonprofit educational purposes. And these questions, commerciality and nonprofit educational purposes, they're different questions, but they're often asked together. The theory being that if someone is making money from their use, it's more reasonable to ask them to get permission for that use, or it's more reasonable to ask them to pay for that use. However, we should not overvalue this commerciality prong. In fact, every single one of the major cases holding that a particular use is fair is about a commercial use. In other words, commerciality, while it's something to consider, right? Commerciality makes something less likely to be fair. It certainly doesn't make something not fair. You can make money from something and still have it be fair use, as more or less every case except Lenz versus Universal holds. So commerciality is one of them, but the piece of this factor that ends up perhaps being the most important is not explicitly there. It's whether or not the use is transformative. Transformativeness makes something more likely to be fair. It's right there in the name of the nonprofit that I volunteer for, the Organization for Transformative Works. And that term, transformativeness, comes from a case called Campbell versus Acuff-Rose, which we'll come back to in a second. But what does transformativeness mean? Well, the idea behind transformativeness is that the more a use transforms the meaning, message, or purpose of the underlying work, the more likely it is to be fair. Or we could say, the more it enriches the expressive landscape or the technological landscape. And so we don't want to make people ask for permission for transformative works. And in fact, you see things like criticism, commentary, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research are all the sorts of things that will transform the meaning of something. If you're criticizing it, you transform its meaning. If you comment on it, you transform its meaning. And transformativeness has been defined very broadly by courts overall. And the takeaway from those transformativeness holdings is that if something is transformative, it's much more likely to be fair use, even if, for example, it's commercial. Right now, let's look at those couple of cases that I mentioned we'd come back to. One is the Campbell case. This case introduced us to the notion of transformativeness when Two Live Crew used a song by Roy Orbison and transformed this sort of crooner pop into a rap song, and a somewhat raunchy rap song at that. The court said Two Live Crew didn't need to ask permission, and one of the driving forces behind that was that Two Live Crew had transformed Roy Orbison's song into something with a different meaning, message, or purpose. I should be clear, though, transformativeness isn't the whole game. It's possible to engage in fair use without being transformative. That was the case with Sony versus Universal. You're not transforming the meaning, message, or purpose of a TV show when you time shift it, but you are making a fair use, right? So transformativeness is highly influential in favor of fair use, but lack of transformativeness doesn't necessarily make something not fair use. So, okay, back to our statutory structure. Our first factor, purpose and character, includes commerciality, nonprofit educational purpose, and transformativeness. The second factor asks about the nature of the copyrighted work on the theory that if a work is mostly facts or functional material, it has thinner protection, and using it is more likely to be fair. Our third factor, amount and substantiality of the portion used in relation to the copyrighted work as a whole, also has two parts, amount and substantiality. And here we're looking at how much did you take and how important was what you took to the underlying work. If you take a lot of a work, your use is less likely to be fair. Likewise, if you take the heart of a work, your use is less likely to be fair. On the other hand, if you don't use very much, or you use something that's less important, your use is more likely to be fair. Here too, though, transformativeness matters. In the Pretty Woman case, for example, the court said, yeah, they took a lot of Roy Orbison's song, and they took the very heart of it. They took the refrain of it. But because it was transformative, we devalue this factor 3, because in order to make a parody, you kind of have to use a lot, and you kind of have to use recognizable portions. The fourth factor is one that some courts have also called the most important, along with the transformativeness part of factor 1, and that is the effect of the use upon the potential market for or value of the copyrighted work. Here, if a work is helping the market for the underlying work, we think, well, maybe that's more likely to be fair. You shouldn't have to ask permission. But even more than that, we say, if it's competing with something that the copyright holder would be likely to do or authorize, then we have more of a problem. If there's market competition there, we think, yeah, you should have to ask permission before you engage in market competition. An interesting and important thing to note here is that if the copyright holder wouldn't be likely to do or authorize a particular kind of use, then it's just a restriction on expression for no reason, right? There's no market competition. There's no reason to require permission for this. And so, generally speaking, this is one reason why courts have said the copyright holder just doesn't own the market for certain kinds of transformative works like commentary and criticism. So you see from this rather compact discussion that this is a highly fact-based analysis. And the answer to a fair use question, until you start digging into it, is almost always going to be maybe. It's an analysis that cannot be automated, and at the same time, it's a basic communicative, expressive right that users have and must be able to take advantage of, just as much as copyright owners have the exclusive right and must be able to take advantage of the right to prevent reproductions that aren't fair use, right? So, right, the exclusive right to prevent reproduction and the right to engage in fair use are parallel to each other. So what does this mean for us, right? Why is this something that Josh says people engage with all the time? Well, fair use means a bunch of things that we all might not think of as fair use. We might just think of them as day-to-day things, but these things exist because of fair use. And I'm going to toss out a bunch of examples here, but you'll see, I think, that there are very few among an eternally long list of things that you probably do every day. So it means that creators and innovators can rely on fair use without getting permission ahead of time and without waiting for an adjudication of fair use. It means that people who want to make fan fiction to combat their depression and post it for their friends and build community can do that without permission. I mentioned that partly, of course, because the Organization for Transformative Works works specifically with fans, helping them to protect their rights and preserve their fan works. It means that celebrities can read stories aloud on YouTube to keep parents from going even more stir crazy during the pandemic. It means that people can publicize video clips of police protests. It means that educators can post materials for their online classes or show videos in those real life in-person classes that we are all really eager to get back to. It means that kids can make dioramas for their classes or can make digital mood boards for their classes. It means that people can make political ads that criticize their opponents by using clips of their opponents' TV interviews. It means that if somebody threatens the sorts of activities on this list with a cease and desist letter, they're engaging in trolling, essentially. And finally, it means that internet filtering is basically impossible. There have been proposals out there to, to engage in automated filtering, and automated filtering might be really useful to the extent it's technologically possible. It's a big question, but it might be really useful for half of that copyright equation. Right? It might be possible for protecting that right to prevent reproduction without authorization, but it's counterproductive and in fact entirely undermining of the other half, the fair use expressive half, because filtering would take down fair uses. Right? This is the story behind Lens versus Universal, where a really simple filter heard a little clip of a Prince song and took down this video that was a manifest fair use. So I think that brings us to the end of our 20-minute fair use basics, almost to the second. But I'm going to hang around during the panel. So if people have questions for me, you're welcome to bring them, although I'm personally looking forward to hearing your questions for the panel. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you, Betsy. And I'm sure folks might have some questions, and so we'll see if any come in afterwards. Now I'm going to ask the panelists for our second panel to turn on their video and manage their mutes, and we can all say goodbye to Betsy with the fair use photo for her screenshot there. But with that, I want to start the next panel. And in this panel, we've got three distinguished experts on fair use who can talk about it both from a public policy perspective and also from the perspective of I'm a Hill staffer using fair use. What does this mean for me? What can I do? What can I do? How does this all work? And so with that, I want to turn it all over to our panelists to introduce themselves. First, Abby, if you can.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. I'm Abby Reeves. I'm IP counsel at Engine Advocacy. We're based here in DC. We're a nonprofit, but we work with a network of thousands of startups across the country in every state and almost every congressional district. And I handle the organization's patent and copyright work.
Great. Ernesto?
Hi, I'm Ernesto Falcone. I'm the Senior Legislative Counsel for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I handle our policy work at the states as well as in Congress on behalf of the legal team, which is the kind of public interest representation in the world of copyright and patents.
Great. And Kodiak?
Hi, everyone. I'm Kodiak Hill-Davis. I'm the Vice President of Government Affairs at the Niskanen Center, which is a nonprofit 501c3 nonpartisan think tank. And while I am a licensed attorney, I definitely have the weakest legal chops of the panel. So I will defer all of your technical questions about what you may and may not do to my co-panelists who are far more qualified than am I. But as a former Hill staffer, I'm really pleased to be here talking about this really important issue.
Great. Kodiak and Ernesto, I actually want to start with you. You both had long careers as staffers on the Hill. I did as well. And how did you as a staffer interact with fair use? And what about other staffers in the office and on the campaign side of things?
Well, I'm happy to start. And we were kind of laughing about this amongst ourselves as we were preparing for the panel the other day. But when I was a Hill staffer, I had a BlackBerry. So some of the ways that you're interacting daily with fair use and copyrighted material, I didn't engage with quite as much. You know, there was no Instagram, no Twitter, no TikTok, although the BlackBerry was a great device for me. But I was engaging more with it in terms of, you know, photocopying passages from books in the Library of Congress, which is of course protected. But, you know, Google did exist at that point, I'm not that old. Googling images that we were going to use in the office, you know, that had more implications. You had to be a little bit more careful with that. But as a Hill staffer, two things really stood out for me. That you always needed to be able to make quick, informed decisions, and you never wanted to embarrass your boss. And so in those ways, I definitely interacted within the boundaries of understanding what my ability to use certain material was, and then what the restrictions were. But I think in our day-to-day lives now, with the prevalence of the internet, it's so much more convoluted and you're dealing with it so much more.
Yeah, you know, what's interesting is, you know, after I worked on the Hill for about 6 years and I did some nonprofit work, I went to law school, and it wasn't until really after I did my copyright class and then, you know, becoming a lawyer that I realized the extent of pretty much anything I was doing interactive with copyrighted works in some way, and fair use played an essential role. So, you know, to give you kind of context of timing, I was on the Hill in 2004. And for those of us that remember, Facebook was not a commercial product for all people at that time. It was still a college kid product. Like you got to be a college campus, you had to have a college email. And then about a year later, I think it was 2005, is when anyone on the, you know, any young person on the Hill can sign on to Facebook because it became available to the public. And so, you know, all the interactions you had, all the postings you had, all of the writings and documents and shared articles, you know, these all implicate fair use in some way. And you know, really at the advent of social media was you know, kind of the beginning of you know, the politics tends to follow that shortly after. When something kind of hits as a way to communicate to people, you know, we start figuring out, okay, how do we reach our constituencies that way? And you know, social media was the early step, starting to do kind of video town halls and things of that nature. You know, these are the things that we started doing, and they all implicate interactive with copyrighted works. And I think what's really super, I think everyone could relate to this, when you're on the Hill and when campaign season comes around and you have to kind of watch the election season take over. Every type of attack ad or response ad requires you to point at the other campaign's materials, and you're running you rely on fair use to be able to make those criticisms and those satirical takedowns and those responses. And so your boss's ability to respond to things, both in terms of their role as a member of Congress and the in the field of the political front, those all implicate fair use. They have to have the ability to kind of express their, it's a First Amendment right in this respect of how fair use is the First Amendment lever of copyright. And politics regularly runs into this because it's about criticism, right? It's about your ability to critique and respond, and that is all protected, in this space.
Josh, I think
Josh,
you're
you're still
on
muted.
mute.
I did that. I'm going to change it up a little and ask Abby a question. Abby, Engine works with internet startups and more established companies like Patreon, Automatic, Medium, and others. Why does fair use matter to startups, and why does it matter to these more established internet platforms?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I think it wouldn't be a Zoom webinar if there weren't at least one instance of somebody talking while on mute. So um, but in response to your question, I think overall in all of the work that Engine does when it comes to IP policy, we emphasize the need for balance in the law, which is where Betsy started off with her conversation. We of course know that patent and copyright law exist generally as a vehicle to help promote the creation and innovation, but it's essential that the laws be balanced and that we not allow copyright and patent law to be used or enforced in such a way that it actually stands in the way of innovation and creativity. And in the copyright context, fair use is a very, very important guardrail or safety valve that makes sure that the law overall is operating in a balanced fashion. Betsy gave some, I thought, really helpful examples. For example, the Betamax case. There we saw an instance where a few copyright owners sought to use claims that users could use technology to infringe copyright to try and limit innovation. And we've of course seen the Betamax is now, I think, very, very much of the past. We've seen VTR technology, DVR technology come along since then, and all of those innovations and the companies that brought those products from ideation to market were relying on fair use as part of the tech company's ability to do the innovation that they were doing. Another example that we've seen that I think we might talk about later in the panel with the recent Supreme Court decision in Oracle versus Google. There, the Supreme Court held that use of certain software interfaces, namely application programming interfaces, was a fair use. And these are really critical interfaces that enable interoperability, and it allows startups, among others, to create products and services that can plug in or communicate with other software, hardware, programs, or platforms. And it's uniquely important for startups to be able to use APIs to have that interoperability and that connectivity to reach their users. And then, Josh, you mentioned specifically a few companies like Patreon and Automatic, and they are among the many, many companies of many, many sizes, from some of the biggest to some of the smallest, that allow users to generate and share their own creative works, to share ideas. And for those sorts of companies that encounter user-generated content, fair use is really critical to the user. And because companies like Automatic, Patreon, their users are very, very important to them. Startup companies that are looking to launch competitive platforms for creators, competitive social media platforms, their users are very, very important to them. So it matters that their users be able to engage in fair use in their creativity, their own expression. And I think as companies get larger, like Patreon and Automatic, they find really interesting ways or important ways they have the bandwidth to look out for and make sure that users are users who are engaged in fair use don't improperly have their content taken off of the platform. But as Betsy mentioned through several examples, fair use is very, very complicated. And so the way the law is currently structured and the way these companies can currently operate, they can host fair use of content without facing this constant threat of litigation against the company themselves, which is important for startups to be able to launch and scale without facing constant threat of litigation. And again, really comes back around to the users that are relying on fair use to engage in their own personal expression.
Thanks, Abby. I'm just going to stop muting myself. This is a question for everyone. So, like, when a staffer is sharing copyrighted content online, whether it's posting something on a website or on the member's Twitter or Facebook feed or a little TikTok or whatever it might be, what do you think they need to think about?
I'll go first. I mean, I think there needs to be an extraordinary appreciation for what fair use enables in that context, because the fact that you don't have to pay a whole bunch of fees or have to get a permission from a whole, various number of players to do what are pretty simple standard, activities is because of fair use in the Supreme Court doctrine and clear, to Abby's point, it's a complicated analysis, but the rulings that come from the Supreme Court are actually very straightforward when they really make it clear, and because then that impacts the technology and the use of technology right away. I think the one thing that it gets underappreciated sometimes is what is copyrighted. It's really not the province of like a handful of select people in the world that get to be creators. All of us are creators. We all are copyright holders every day in everything we do, because all it takes to create a copyright is a modicum of creativity on a fixed medium. That's essentially kind of the legal standard, which is extremely low, and it carries with a lot of implications in terms of liability, in terms of violating someone's copyright. But then that's balanced very effectively and very importantly with fair use to ensure expression and kind of political participation and political activity that always incorporates a whole bunch of copyrighted works that get involved, particularly when you talk about the internet.
As a follow-up to that, I mean, Abby, you mentioned the Google case earlier. In that case, the majority explained that fair use plays a really important role in promoting progress and creativity, and why fair use is such an important part of our copyright system. Yet, many Phil staff are probably hearing all the time about how fair use is this bad anti-creator thing that's being used to steal people's works. Can you kind of both rebut that claim and also talk about all the ways that fair use does promote progress and creativity?
Yeah, I'm happy to start with a few examples maybe are helping to illustrate this. But I think overall what we see in the Supreme Court's recent opinion is a very, very clear, like Ernesto said, I mean, I think it comes across very clearly in the majority opinion about the appreciation of the need for balance in the law and making sure that we understand where the copyright that does, I mean, software is eligible for copyright. You write software code, it's copyrightable, but it's highly functional. It has, if you allow somebody to get protection over code without some safety valves there, it really has the opportunity to not just I don't know the right way to say this, but I mean, it has competition concerns, right? Like you can stop other people from making certain sorts of products that have a functionality. So it's not like a movie, you can't copy The Lion King. It's a functional thing, and there are a lot of ways in which copyright operates that way. So the Supreme Court was really recognizing the importance of understanding what the copyrighted work at issue is, why the use is being done that's at issue in the infringement allegation, and then what the implications would be if we were to allow copyright to prevent those sorts of uses. I think about in my own family, like my husband gives movie reviews on an internet radio program, and it is absolutely essential that when he wants to, and I mean that's his creativity, right? He watches the movies, he thinks about them, he does a lot of research to understand the historical context of a documentary, and he wants to share his opinions with the viewers that value whether or not he thinks you should go see a movie. Without fair use, he wouldn't be able to do any of that, and so that's a whole form of creation and expression that would be brought to a halting stop if we didn't have fair use. Betsy gave some other examples, history books. My parents are both professors, and I think everybody for the past year has been thinking about educating remotely. And in order to be able to educate students remotely, you have to be able to use copyrighted content. You have to be able to put it on slides and show it over Zoom or over Google Meet. And if we didn't have fair use, none of those sorts of educational activities would be possible in the classroom, but definitely wouldn't be possible while we're doing remote learning. So there are all these ways in which the ability of fair use really furthers creation, expression, and innovation.
Claudia, do you have any thoughts on this or anything to add?
Well, I think my co-panelists have made excellent points, and I hope that one of the takeaways here really is how many different ways fair use really interacts with so much of your different work, whether it's, as Abby just pointed out, remote learning, which I don't think any of us anticipated 18 months ago that we'd be doing primarily, or as Ernesto pointed out earlier, the ability to distinguish if you're using things to distinguish your boss from another member of Congress. So fair use really does have an implication day to day in what you're doing.
Josh, if I can add one quick thing. I think people, staff really have to understand if they're being told that the Supreme Court case on Google v. Oracle, Oracle v. Google, was wrong. They have to really kind of dig into the nuts and bolts of like what was the debate about? And the debate was like, can computer code be used in ways to promote innovation, create creative new uses? And I think that if you're not familiar with computer code, you may think it is some sort of there's some sort of like magic, I guess, behind it. But computer code at its core is a language, and what you see often in EFF represents people as a public interest firm. So we represent a lot of coders and people who can't afford a lawyer and run into lots of concerns and stuff. But this community really builds on itself. So someone figures out a clever way to make something do a certain thing on a phone. And then the next coder is like, okay, let me learn how you did that. And you know what? I could think of a slightly different way or better way to do something else. And I'm going to learn from what you were able to build on. And then the next coder after them builds on that foundation. They keep kind of building up better and more sophisticated stuff. If we start saying, oh, but you know what, that first coder is owed, has to give permission first for the second coder or the 100th or the 1000th or the millionth coder down the line who comes up with something innovative from this original idea. And these are ideas, not creative expression, that is, and really properly fall in patents in certain cases. We are talking about a huge problem in terms of how computer coding works in this world. And I get worried at times when staff who probably have no familiarity with how to code their own stuff or even just the basic understanding of how computer code works, you're being told it's a terrible case and it should be rethought without knowing just how actual innovation happens in the world of software and hardware.
Excellent. Ernesto, I'm going to stick with you and bring up the First Amendment. So fair use is often called by courts and experts as the safety valve that allows copyright enforcement to coexist with the First Amendment. Can you explain why to people as someone who works with an organization that's very focused on this?
Yeah, so if we go back to like Betsy did a phenomenal job of giving the history here. We're a country that was founded with the First Amendment and with the Progress in Science Clause. And the idea is we wanted to give creators or people who create something in terms of what we protect under copyright, an ability to monetize that commercially. But then at the same time, we also believe in the freedom of expression and First Amendment rights, that Congress shall make no law that restrains your speech rights. And so you have this real tension of like, you're able to create the government's handing a monopoly over an expression, an artistic expression of sorts, or expressive work, and also saying, but we also can't create laws that say you're not allowed to use or express yourself. And so this is where fair use essentially plays the role of being this First Amendment safety valve, where We want to make sure that you are incentivized and able to monetize the work, but we also don't want to make it so that it's so overreaching that you actually prevent people from speaking. And where you see it often, I think Betsy's example is a great one here, negative commentary or commentary review. If I think your song sucks, or if I think your movie sucks, there is no means of, in the United States at least, there is no means for you to prevent me from saying that in a public space, all right, and to be able to use the works to make that expression as a reviewer. And that was intentional, right? And that's a kind of a pretty clear link between how the First Amendment and interactive copyrighted works operates.
Great, thanks, Ernesto. Abby, any perspectives on that, given the, you work with companies and obviously corporations do have free speech and First Amendment rights as well. Anything to add to what Ernesto just said?
No, I don't have anything to add. I think it just grounding the conversation. I mean, they're grounding this conversation with the First Amendment as something that has to be balanced against copyright law is a really, really critical piece of the analysis. But I agree exactly with what Ernesto said.
Great. So another area of copyright law that ReCreate works on a lot, and all of you work on, is the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, and specifically Section 512, which sets up the whole system for how creative content that's posted online, how copyright holders can have it removed and how the people who post it can have it put back up, and tries to create a functional system around that. What's often not talked about in the context of 512 is how it actually, this system interacts with fair use. And there, I would love folks' thoughts on how the notice and takedown system and how we deal with things interacts with the fair use rights of people online.
Well, Josh, this is Kodiak. I'm going to say right away that I am completely unqualified to answer this question, and I will defer to my co-panelists Ernesto and Abby on this one.
Well, I'm happy to start with some thoughts. I think this is, it's a great question. Thank you. And I think there's a lot to unpack, probably more than we can accomplish during this session. But one of the other examples that I think about when I think about fair use, and it kind of ties together several of the questions up until now, is one of the cartoonists that I follow on Patreon. So, he makes cartoons and it's his own universe, it's his own characters, but periodically, in order to make a joke, he brings in his own drawing of a Marvel character, for example, and it's a vehicle to communicate his joke. That's of course a fair use. His Spider-Man doesn't look anything like the real Spider-Man. It's a way to tell jokes to the community of people that are fans of this cartoonist. So that's a fair use, and I don't know if he gets takedowns from, I guess Spider-Man is owned by Sony, but he's not posting clips of Spider-Man movie, and but so just with that as an example to start, as we're thinking about the way the DMCA interacts here. For those who don't know, Section 512 of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act sets up the notice and takedown framework for handling allegations of copyright infringement online. So were Sony to think that this cartoonist was infringing their rights, they would send a takedown notice to Patreon. Under the law, Patreon is expected to take the cartoon offline, and then the creator, whose content in this case was wrongfully removed, has the opportunity to submit a dispute through Patreon and tell the content owner, I don't think I'm infringing your copyright, and unless Sony files a lawsuit, then the content gets restored. And that's the basics of how the system works. And it works very well. It's relative, it's not perfect, there are problems, but overall quite balanced. Copyright owners who know what their creative content are in a position of identifying, are in the best position to identify what they think is infringing. Platforms can connect the users and the copyright owners when there are these allegations of infringement, and have basically an immediate, often permanent injunction entered at a mere accusation of infringement. If the DMCA were changed, for example, to shift the responsibility onto the company to identify copyright infringement and to remove things that are infringing copyright, it would really fundamentally undercut the ability of, for example, small internet-enabled creators to engage in fair use, because it would either be that companies themselves have to learn what is copyrighted, learn what is infringement, make these fair use determinations in a vacuum of the necessary information. And if they get the answer wrong, face very steep damages in court were they allowing infringement to remain on the platform, which would create a very strong incentive in favor of removing even non-infringing content, removing fair uses. And as Betsy noted, technological filters are incapable of doing the context-specific analysis that has to be done to identify whether or not something is a fair use. So somebody could upload an image of Spider-Man on the internet. It could be infringing, and a filter might say, okay, this is Spider-Man, I need to take it down. But the cartoonist that I'm a fan of could draw his own Spider-Man, use it in one small frame of a multi-frame comic. It's a fair use, but the computer doesn't know that. It sees Spider-Man, and if it can identify Spider-Man, then it's going to, the companies, to avoid litigation, have a very, very strong incentive to pull that fair use down. So those are some of the concerns that your question, I think, poses for the companies we work with.
It was really helpful. So we have 8 minutes left, and I don't have any questions from the audience. So let me try and wind this down and ask I think what's the easiest question to ask right now, which is if there was one thing you could have every person who's attended this take away from this about fair use, what would it be? And I'll start with Kodiak.
Well, thank you. So I think my one key takeaway would be, as congressional staff, your job is to help make the laws, and fair use actually helps you do your job.
Ernesto?
So, all of the discussion right now on, opening up platforms and competition and kind of rethinking the technology market, this all is intertwined with copyright. And if I think Abby illustrated very well, there are lots of legacy players, very large players, are saying, oh, we need more requirements, more mandates, more obligations on companies who want to do business on the internet in order to exist, in order to handle copyrighted works. If we go down that route, we will only have a handful of internet companies, and it'll be a very different world than what brought the internet to where it was now, which was very low barriers of entry, very open to innovators. Your college student who comes up with a cool idea is able to become able to make something awesome because they have the internet to connect everyone and to share with everyone, and everyone is able to connect with them. We will lose that. And that is something that I think every Hill staffer needs to take, real direct responsibility for the future of where the internet goes, because the law and what laws we do dictate the market and the structure and the ability for all of us as citizens to interact with one another. And you may, you may be told like, oh, you couldn't possibly break the internet, quote unquote. But you screw with liability enough, and you make it apply to too many things, and you make it the ability to build a product and connect to the internet harder, to a degree that copyright, in terms of the damages that are involved in the the 6-digit range. You will never have an internet that is the world of garage startups and people with limited resources being the next big thing. And that's a huge value to lose. And but there is no constituency, right, that defends that, in terms of they don't have lobbyists, right? That's what the public interest folks try to really articulate. But there's not a lot of money to keep the value of what has made the internet awesome. And it's very important to understand your responsibility in that respect.
Abby?
Agree with Ernesto. Thanks for making many of my points for me. The only other thing I think I would add is just to reiterate, of course, copyrighted content is extraordinarily prevalent in our everyday lives, and fair use is also extraordinarily prevalent, ubiquitous in our everyday lives. It's very important. It's tough sometimes, but it is very, very critical to protect the role that fair use plays in our IP systems.
Thanks, Abby, and I'll take the moderator's prerogative for the final point I'd like to make today before we end, which is, just in putting on this webinar, I have counted over 100 examples that I could just know of fair uses happening to make today happen, whether it's the transformativeness of the artwork that's sitting above Abby's shoulder, or it's the ability for Betsy to, have images in her presentation, and frankly, the ability of Zoom to be willing to host a webinar on their platform where so many copyrighted works are being used, and that if we were to change this system, if we were to move towards a notice and takedown system or a notice and stay down system, or put mandatory filter requirements, all sorts of types of things on as something that internet platforms need to do, right? Or an active duty to monitor, right? This doesn't happen. Zoom can't, there's so much liability on the line for Zoom potentially, given that it's $150,000 per work infringed as possible damages, that Zoom probably financially would face too high of a liability to, first of all, have ever gotten funded as a company to begin with. And second of all, would probably not allow screen sharing and other types of functionalities that are currently built into it. Would probably require just a blank background, all sorts of things to make this happen. And so, you get to attend all these lovely Zoom events because of fair use.